I am the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Abercrombie & Fitch. I'm the first person to hold that job. I also teach a class at the University of Chicago Law School on corporate compliance and business integration, where I'm the first person to teach that class. So all told, I would say I spend more than half my time explaining what it is I do around here. And I like that question because I love the answer, because it's always changing. You know, as the scope of corporate compliance and how you engage, as that grows, I'm constantly reminded of how important it is at the individual level to act with integrity and to feel the confidence to speak up or to challenge assumption. And so let's talk about that in terms of the work that I do, corporate culture generally, and then in the personal context. When I talk about my work, I talk about it as being the intersection of the want to and the have to, right? And so the have to, you know, you're a business. What are your legal regulatory obligations to be in your business, in your market? That's your have to. And as everybody on this call knows, if you're in the business world, those obligations, they keep ratcheting up, right? Whether it's auditors, regulators, whoever, they're expecting more. And so that's the have to side. But the way that you're most effective on the have to is on the want to, right? If you can tie to corporate purpose, if you can tie to a company's values or their philanthropic efforts, right? If you can tie your business needs to those corporate wants or those ideals, right? That intersection is where you can make the most difference. And so that's where I play, right? In that intersection. And as big as that is, right? The ability and the power of one person to have an influence is always retained. And so let's start with compliance first. You know, Department of Justice, UK Serious Fraud Office, the UN, right? No shortage of folks want to tell me what a good corporate compliance program looks like, you know, and every year new stuff comes out and it's all the same. It asks you to have, you know, clear policies, relevant training, detailed reporting, consistent enforcement. Whatever the language, whatever the regulatory body, all those things matter. Of course, it makes sense. But the research shows that the key indicator of a good program is the individual employee's comfort and willingness to speak up, right? Their ability, their willingness to raise their hand, right? To question or challenge an assumption, right? If something seems out of place. And so what I've learned in my time is that I can have the prettiest looking, you know, brochures and slide decks and everything. But if the employees, they either don't know or are too scared to come forward, the program's worthless. And so I spend my time as Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer explaining to folks how we're all agents of the company, right? You're here because you're passionate about the brands. You know, you don't need to be the anti-corruption expert. You don't need to be the anti-money laundering expert. You just have to know you're an agent of this company, right? And that if we're here to protect and promote, you can do your part by raising your hand, by speaking up if you see something out of place. And so that's how you get at a culture of compliance, and that's how you leverage your power of one in compliance, right? But if you move even bigger, if you move into corporate culture generally, which is a really, really hot topic. Why is it a hot topic? Who cares? Because it's a value differentiator, right? In institutional shareholders, folks like BlackRock, the Big Four, they talk a lot about corporate culture as a buzzword, because if you can align people's work to that business purpose, that corporate culture, research shows they're going to work harder, they're going to stay longer, your company's going to perform better. So hell yeah, you want to have a good corporate culture. Comes down to the power of one again. Your organizational design research, your organizational communication research, it always comes back to this concept of the individual disruptor, right? The idea of the positive influencer, the change agent. Somebody who, and I'm going to quote from a HBR article from last year that said, you know, every organization at all levels has a pool of change agents, right? People that are purpose-driven, that are optimistic in nature, and that inspire others at all levels. They inspire others because they're willing to speak up, right? And they're willing to challenge assumption. So we're not even in compliance. We're not even in rulemaking. We're in innovation. We're in effective culture management. And so what I tell my students, right, it doesn't matter. It's helpful, right? If your leadership is aligned with the corporate purpose and the ideals, absolutely helpful. But every individual has the chance to be a disruptor, to lead with integrity, have their words match their actions, and not be afraid to raise their hand or challenge an assumption, to have that power of one. And so if I'm talking to my employees, my examples would be, somebody from supply chain or account payable where something didn't look right and they raised their hand and saved the company a lot of money, right? Or they questioned the boss's decision on picking somebody's golf buddy as our next business partner as opposed to going through the RFP process. Lots of examples I can use. People at all levels willing to act with integrity, challenge assumptions, speak up. And when I'm talking to my class, I can use examples of institutional whistleblowers, right? Or tech innovators, disruptors that came in, challenged assumption, came up with a new way and a new approach. But just for this audience, right? And following on the heels of Kadala, I'll give a different example. I'll give a personal one. This is my mother. She's the little girl. This is the 50s. This is the west side of San Antonio. So my mom, stop that. My mom was the middle child of 7, right? Number 4, 7, and the youngest girl. And before she hit school age, she had it tough. She was actually run over. And so I say she learned to walk, and then she learned to walk again. And by the time she got to middle school, there were, 3 more boys in the family. Like I said, she was, the middle of 7 children, and she was scared. She was book smart. She wasn't street smart, and she was little. And there was a lot of violence in the neighborhood and violence in the public school. And she didn't know. She didn't know what the path would be, right? And she didn't like the assumptions that were laid out for her. And so what I talk about is I say, she walked across the street. So my mother, living with my grandmother, right across the street was my great-grandmother, right? She walked across the street and she asked for help. And applied for, got a scholarship to go to a Catholic high school. It was a bit out of town and required, a couple buses each way. And she was Mexican, so she wasn't allowed to take Spanish. She wasn't allowed to speak Spanish in school. She didn't know these people. And it wasn't easy, right? But she reached out and she challenged those assumptions and she made a difference. She made a difference in her own life and made my life possible, right? She hasn't talked about it much. I know it wasn't easy, but the story that sticks out for me, the small details, right? She always talks about, she used to talk about field day, and it was the one day a year you could wear your own clothes to school. And she hated field day because all she had was those 2 uniforms. And every year she stressed about, do I act like I forgot it was field day and show up in my uniform, or do I skip school this one day? Couldn't have been easy. None of it was, but she exercised that power of one. She challenged that assumption, and she made her life possible and made mine too. So the call to action, right? When I'm talking to my employees, it is, will you raise your hand? Will you act with integrity? Will you ask questions? And I ask the same thing of my students. Will you challenge assumptions regardless of your level? And here I ask the same, right? How can you exercise that power of one? How at work, how in life? And thank you.